My life has always been a struggle for a place in the sun. I grew up in a family where I was perceived as second class, although I did not understand this until a certain age. My brother, 3 years younger than me, was always the favorite of my parents. He got everything he wanted: a new phone, expensive clothes, the opportunity to study abroad. And me, I worked, trying to prove that I was also worth something, that I also deserved support. One day I got a call from my late grandfather's lawyer. I was surprised because my grandfather rarely mentioned wills or money. But that call changed everything. My grandfather left me and my brother an equal share of the inheritance, money that could be a chance to change my life. I could not believe my luck. My eyes filled with tears as I read the documents. It was not just money, it was an opportunity. I had always dreamed of starting my own business, and now this dream had become a reality. When I got home, I felt a mixture of excitement and fear. I knew my parents had always supported my brother more, but this was my grandfather's will. It was his will. He decided that my brother and I deserved equal opportunities. I sat down at the table in the living room and said, "I got a call from the law firm. My grandfather left us equal shares of the inheritance. This is a huge opportunity for me. I planned to." I didn't have time to finish. Mom and Dad looked at each other, and there was silence in the air. Then my father sighed heavily and said a phrase that will forever be etched in my memory. "Your brother needs this money more." I froze, trying to understand if I had heard correctly. Was it a joke? A mistake? But no, there was not a hint of doubt or shame on my parents' faces. "What?" was all I could whisper. "You see," my mother said calmly, "your brother is building his own future. He wants to start a business, and you have always had a stable income." Stable income. I worked day and night, trying to make ends meet, while my brother spent money on new cars and expensive trips. "You're kidding, right?" I tried to remain calm, but inside I was seething. "It's my money. Grandpa left it to me. He wanted us to get an equal share." My father just waved it away. Grandpa didn't understand anything in real life. He was old and couldn't see the real picture. I clenched my fists. "And what is the real picture, Dad?" "You are strong," he answered, as if that explained everything. "You will cope, and your brother needs help. Business is serious, and it is harder for a woman to make it in this world. You better find a stable job and not worry about such things." At that moment, I had only one desire: to laugh. Bitterly, loudly, with hysterical notes. So everything I have done all these years is nothing? The fact that I have worked harder than anyone in this family, studied, invested in my development, is nothing? "We just made a decision," my mother said as if it were an ordinary, everyday moment. "And you better not argue." I felt a cold lump growing in my chest. I was waiting for support. I was waiting for at least some kind of excuse. But they did not even doubt their words. "Okay," I said in a flat voice, getting up from the table. "I understand." Mom nodded contentedly, as if I agreed with their decision. But something inside me broke. The feeling of betrayal never left me. All my efforts, every sacrifice, every morning wake-up call, all to gain recognition, all to be an equal among equals in the family, and instead I found myself outside of it. I silently left my parents' house and drove home. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't make a scene. I just got in my car and drove. It may have been one of the worst moments of my life, but it was also a moment of epiphany. I wouldn't allow myself to be weak. I wouldn't allow them to believe that I was who they saw me as. I had to create my own reality. At that moment, I realized I had to start from scratch. It was a blow, but at the same time an opportunity. An opportunity that I could use to prove to everyone, including myself, that I was no longer dependent on their decisions. I decided that I would find a new path and would no longer be tied to my parents. This was my fight, and I had to win it alone. The first few weeks after my exile were tough. Most of my friends turned their backs on me, and I began to fight alone for every ounce of stability. I worked as a waitress in a cafe, pouring all my emotions into every move. I was rejected by the best restaurants because of my inexperience, but I didn't give up. I kept learning, even when every muscle in my body was tired. But that wasn't enough. I knew that in order to achieve something greater, I needed a plan. I enrolled in a finance course to understand how to manage money. Later, I learned programming to add another important skill to my arsenal. Step by step, I built up my knowledge, and although it was difficult, I felt like I could finally take control. My goal was simple: to become a person they would never see me as. While I was working, trying to build my life, my brother did not stop in his irresponsibility. The whole family was already aware that he was wasting everything he received. His parents, instead of reminding him of his responsibilities, continued to protect him. I learned about this from the news, from mutual acquaintances. He was spending money on cars, expensive trips that ended quickly. All this was known even among his friends. Instead of investing his inheritance correctly, he went with the flow, getting everything from life, not making any effort to achieve success. Every time I heard that he was making a new purchase, or that he was going to go on another trip, my heart felt disappointed. How could they give everything to him? How could they say that he needs it more? And what outraged me most was that my parents continued to support him even when they saw everything going to collapse. They even said, "He's young. These are his first mistakes. He'll find his way." They simply couldn't accept that I had succeeded on my own without their help. I was indignant that they didn't realize my sacrifices, my efforts. But instead of seething inside, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I no longer intended to sit in the shadows, wait and suffer. Now that I had my clients, my achievements, I was ready to act. I began to actively plan and look for ways to strengthen my position. I understood that for this I had to work even harder, and it wouldn't be easy. But nothing could stop me. I had long decided for myself that I would be independent, and I would never allow my life to depend on someone else's decisions again. But at the same time, I also watched my brother continue to fall deeper and deeper into his debts. I thought about how this would all end, and the more I heard about his new financial difficulties, the more I realized that he would destroy everything he had inherited. What I went through was overwhelming. But eventually, I started to see it as an opportunity, not a defeat. It was hard at first. Learning a new business, managing my finances, making decisions all the time. It was all on my shoulders. The feeling of having to start from scratch again was extremely difficult, but at the same time, I felt like this was my moment. If not now, then when? My first steps were on a small platform. I couldn't afford to make mistakes because every failure I made could have serious consequences. It was a game of survival. But I was stubborn. If they didn't think I was strong enough to inherit, now I would prove to them that I could create my own path to success. I decided to launch an online platform that would allow people to find high-quality services for their businesses, and I targeted a specific niche: financial consulting and marketing for small businesses. I tried to take control of everything, from marketing strategies to customer relationships. Every client was important. Every feedback or problem I was able to solve was an achievement. At first, it was small projects, but I felt that my efforts were starting to bear fruit. I spent countless nights at the computer, checking every document, every strategy, to make sure everything was going according to plan. The first months were hard, but after a few months I started to see the first significant results. I gathered a team that was ready to work the way I did, and every time I saw the results, I realized that it was all worth it. Every new contract, every new client was confirmation that I was taking the right steps. But what struck me most was how my view of myself changed. I was no longer the girl who could be simply dismissed or ignored. I stood my ground and proved to everyone that I didn't need help. I was my own help. Later, when the business started to make steady money, I could no longer return to my old life. My goal was different. I had to get even more than what was once taken from me. And I was ready for it. I still remember the day everything changed. A client I had been negotiating with for a long time called me and said he wanted to sign a contract. It was my first big deal, and I knew it was the key. It wasn't just a client. It was an opportunity to build a solid foundation for my business. At that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a small business I was trying to build. It was a chance to prove that I deserved recognition, that I was capable of more than just fulfilling other people's plans. We signed the deal, and I felt every cell in my body fill with energy. That moment was my victory. Not as big as I would have liked, but important to me. This success was my first step towards real recognition. Now my thinking had changed. I was no longer sitting in the shadows. I was no longer letting myself be humiliated. Now I was the one making the decisions. I learned to enjoy the fact that I was on the path to my dreams. With each new client, with each new deal, my relationships with the people I worked with became better and better. I always tried to leave an impression of a professional, but I no longer depended on other people's opinions. I no longer had to settle for being just a weak option. I was ready to make a statement. From that moment on, I began to put everything on the line. Step by step, my reputation grew stronger. I received my first high-paying contracts and realized that my business was destined to develop. I was sure that this was just the beginning. With each month, as I became more and more successful, I felt how everything I had done before was finally bearing fruit. And this was only the beginning of a great victory. I wasn't expecting this call. It was late at night, when I was already going to bed, tired after a hard day. My phone vibrated, and I saw my mother's name on the screen. At first I hesitated, not knowing what was waiting inside. But I decided to pick up the phone. "Danya, we have a problem." Her voice sounded gloomy, and I already felt that this would not be a simple conversational call. "What happened?" I asked, already feeling that something was wrong. "Your brother, he made a big debt, and now we are in a debt hole. All the money we had was spent on him. Now we are in a difficult situation, and your brother doesn't even want to admit his mistakes. You have always been good and strong. Maybe you can help us," my mother said in a strained voice. Her words hit me like a stab in the back. Remembering how they had thrown me out when I needed support the most was like hitting me in the weakest spot. It was hard to put into words what I was feeling. I couldn't believe that the same people who had once rejected me were now asking for help. All the fear, pain, and loneliness I had dealt with when I was homeless were starting to come out. Now they were begging me for help. "Mom, do you remember how you made me leave when I needed help the most?" I replied, trying to keep my voice calm even though everything inside was burning. "I was forced to start from scratch. You told me I had to handle it on my own. Now you want me to help you." I felt her words trigger an even greater internal struggle within me. I couldn't make a decision right away. It was a moment when my soul was torn between past pain and the opportunity to do something good. "We've all made mistakes," my mother said. "But we're your family. Do you want to leave us in trouble?" I remained silent, feeling the gap between us widen. But I knew the choice ahead would not be easy. That call made me dive into the memories of everything that had happened. My mind started to replay the moments when I stood in front of the door of my house, offended and abandoned. When my parents declared that they no longer needed me and that I had to solve my problems on my own. When I spent the night in my car, not knowing where to go. When the people I considered family lost my hopes and faith in them. I remembered how I worked for weeks on my projects, trying to prove that I deserved their love and support, and not just criticism. My struggle was hard, and every step towards success was the price of incredible effort. But after I found out that my parents had given their entire inheritance to my brother, leaving me nothing, a whole part of me broke. I was the one who always worked for their benefit, but for some reason it didn't matter. Now they call and beg for help. Of course, there was more regret and fear in their words than genuine gratitude, and even if they apologized, it didn't change how I felt. Their question, should I help them, again stirred up my inner contradictions. "Mom, you don't even understand how much it cost me to build what I have, how much I spent fighting for my place in life, and how you rejected me when I was at my weakest," I replied. "Now I have to save you." I couldn't forget how they laughed at me when I tried to gather evidence and try to prove my worth. They laughed at my ideas, at my small steps that later became great achievements. "I understand why you did it," I said, turning to my mother, "but I can't forgive what you did. If you want help, it won't be so easy with other people." Those words left the room in a deep silence. I didn't even hear her voice for a few seconds as I digested their call. All I could do was make a decision that I felt would change my entire life. Now that the call was over and I was alone in my thoughts, I felt my angry emotional wave turn into a reflection on how it had all happened. I had long assumed that they would come to me for help, but even now, when I heard it in their words, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents were trying to manipulate my emotions again, appealing to the bond of kinship and family. It wasn't just funny, it was painful. As soon as I agreed to support them, they didn't even mention the incredible pain I had gone through when they left me. They didn't even remember how they themselves had declared that "you'll be fine." Now they were turning to me again, as if for another rescue, in the hope that I would be useful to them again. My voice was cold but firm. You said yourself that I could handle it, that I was strong. And here I am, having built what I have on my own. And you are trying to break my life in order to avoid the consequences of your own mistakes. You can't just ask me to save you when you yourself have destroyed it all. I felt like my words sounded harsh, but that was exactly what they needed to hear. Moreover, I wanted to show them that I was no longer the weak and helpless girl I had been before. I was a different person now. My strength was in not trying to be what they wanted. I had created my own life and my own opportunities, and now they were trying to turn everything back on, but it was impossible. All these years I had prayed that my parents would see that I was worthy of their attention and support, but now I realized that their love had always been selective. And now that they needed me, I would not change my principles. My help could not be given in the way it had been before. And I was not going to save them because their inability to admit their mistakes and the reasons for their choices was undeniable. I felt not only disappointment, but a real sense of victory boiling inside me. In the end, I was stronger than they thought, and I was not going to let them disappoint me again. They were on their knees before me, their eyes locked with fear and despair. I couldn't believe that I, the very person they had always tried to pin down, was now standing taller than them. I saw my parents, the people I had once loved, trying to hold on to their pride, but it was too late. They had lost. My brother, the very man they had always put above me, the one they had considered the heir to the business, had ruined everything. Now he sat before me, his eyes blank, his head down, unable to find the words to justify his downfall. His attempts to solve his problems, through my kindness, no longer had any power. My parents could no longer afford to play the victim. They had become weak, and their falsehood burned into my eyes. All these years they had been standing on my neck, not letting me breathe, and now they had to admit their mistakes. And this was my moment. Do you want me to help? I asked. Do you want to get back what you lost because of your attitude towards me? Are you ready to go back and ask for help from the same person you kicked out of your home, in whom you saw no value? Their faces turned even paler, but I felt no sympathy. No, I was not the one who would lend a hand to the one who made me suffer. Their pride turned out to be just a facade they created to hide their own weakness. My heart was no longer tied to their manipulations, and I felt that finally a new chapter in my life was beginning. I was no longer a slave to their standards, no longer allowing them to use me for their own benefits. I was ready to move on, despite their efforts to hold me back. And what I felt now was not regret. I felt only relief, because I was free. I looked at their disfigured faces and just smiled. This was my victory. They realized that everything they had done had led them to their downfall. And the worst thing for them was that their world no longer had that important element, me. When I finished talking to my parents and brother, when they left my office, I was left alone with their pleas and their fears in my head. I sat in my chair and looked out the window. The moon was shining brightly on the city, and I felt my heart fill with something important. I was no longer dependent on them. But there was one important thing left. I didn't have to blame them or help them. I had to decide whether to leave them in the past or give them a chance. They had taken so many years from me that I couldn't get back, and now they wanted my forgiveness. I could have just forgiven them and moved on. But was that the right decision? I thought about all the times they had thrown me to the sidelines, when I was just a convenient victim for them to justify. They wouldn't even let me take my share of the inheritance, because only my brother was supposed to get it. And I, who worked in the shadows and proved my worth, was now the one they thought would live without it. My sense of self-worth wouldn't allow me to just forgive. I had worked hard, achieved my victories, and done everything to prove to myself that I was worth more than they thought. And now I had a choice, to give them a chance or to leave them in a world where they were nothing without me. I made a choice. I gathered all the documents and responded in writing to their numerous appeals. My response was short and clear. You yourself taught me how to be independent, and now I will cope on my own. But there is no longer a place in my life for those who devalued me. Putting my pen on the table, I realized that this was my final decision. I was no longer a weak victim of their manipulations. I was stronger, and now my strength was in moving forward without the one who always offended me. I stood in front of my house, my phone in my hand, wondering if I should give them a chance. Their calls kept coming, and I could hear the despair in their voices. My mother said that everything that had happened had been a mistake, that they no longer saw me as the enemy. And my father had asked for help, which was hard to hear, especially after everything they had told me. But I was no longer the girl I had been. I was no longer willing to give my energy to cover up their mistakes. I felt my hands tighten around the phone, my mind replaying the moments when they had decided to give my inheritance to my brother. This was just the beginning, and now I had a choice. I had what they had never had, control over my own life. I decided to meet them, but on my own terms. I told my parents that I was ready to help, but first they needed to understand how much they had lost and why I was no longer their devoted daughter. Each of them tried to find words of justification, but I no longer felt any sympathy. I explained to them that I was not going to just help without understanding why their lives were in this situation. I had my conditions. You must show that you are ready to change. I have already learned not to depend on you. Now it is your turn to take the first step. These were not just words. I stood my ground, ready for any decision they would make. It became difficult for my parents. They could not immediately find the right words to respond. And in the end, it was difficult for my brother, who had always been protected by their position, to understand. But now there was no going back. I could not leave the past behind. I could no longer sit and wait for them to change. All their attempts to reach an understanding with me had failed. They had paid a high price for underestimating me, and they knew it. Now that I was stronger, more confident, had built my own life, and had achieved more than they could ever imagine, I was ready to move on. They had lost so much and could not get back what they once had. Their attempts to justify their mistakes were now futile. Those moments when I had been helpless, watching them give everything to their brother, and I was left with nothing, were now just memories. I was no longer the girl sitting on the bench, waiting for someone to give her a chance. Now I was ready for a new beginning, and my family had no choice but to accept that fact. I sat in the silence of my new office, watching the world go by through the huge window overlooking the city. The sun was setting, illuminating the horizon of my new life, which I had finally built myself. All these years, I had been a silent witness to other people's decisions, opinions, and betrayals. All these years, I had worked for their imaginary happiness, hoping that one day I would receive my share. But now I knew one thing. I no longer needed their permission or their gifts. I decided for myself what would happen in my life and how. Opening my laptop, I began to check the latest reports on my business. Everything was going according to plan, and my efforts began to yield real results. Here it was, my victory. Not recognition from my parents, not confirmation from others, just my struggle and my achievements. But at that moment, the phone rang. My sister's name appeared on the screen. I thought for a few seconds before picking up the phone. "Hello," I said, trying not to show emotion. "Can you come?" I heard her voice tremble. "We're in a very difficult situation. You know, brother." I understood that they were still hoping for my help. But should I really help them? Should I take another step back and return to the life I left behind? No, I decided. The answer was clear, and I didn't hesitate. "I'm sorry, but I've already decided that I won't go back to this anymore. I'm not the same person I was before. This was my last step towards freedom. I didn't feel anger. I didn't regret it. I finally felt how hard it had been for me in the past, when I wanted to be part of this family that didn't value me. Now I was free from their thoughts and manipulations, and it was the best decision of my life. My dreams weren't about lifting others up when they didn't want to lift themselves up. My goal was to fulfill myself, and I was doing it. I was building a new business, new relationships, new dreams that no longer depended on what other people thought. After taking a few steps towards the future, I smiled. All this time, I wasn't looking for recognition from others, but for my inner strength. And now that I had found it, I wasn't going to stop.